Shia LaBeouf is losing his mind.
I think a lot of people probably saw some of the Mardi Gras media coverage.
I understand.
Heard about the arrest and stuff.
God bless him.
Likely want to know how you're doing.
Bro, I've been having a time of my life. You know, I got some contrition on my heart, you know what I mean? It's not nice to hurt people, ever. It's fucking lame. People got hurt, I gotta deal with that. I'm gonna deal with that. I'm gonna deal with that in full. I'll eat it all. It's on me. It's not on them. It's on me. I fucked up. It's on me. I fucked up. It's on me.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So you take responsibility for
1000%. We're not gonna play games.
Yeah.
But I had a great time.
And unfortunately, I truly think this is the case. That being said, this is not a typical commentary video made to just slander and condemn him, nor is it to defend him. Rather, this is an ASMR commentary video where you can just leave me playing in the back while you're doing something productive, trying to get stuff done, trying to fall asleep, or trying to get your day started. But let's just jump straight into it. He recently did a pretty iconic interview with a channel called Channel 5, and in this hour-long or so video, he's basically cycling through so many emotions and so many states of mind. At one point, he's very self-aware and proclaiming his love for his religious conversion, I guess. And then the next moment he's crying, but also expressing extreme anger and shame. And it's kind of all over the place. It's quite erratic, but my God, you have to admit, it's extremely entertaining. And should we use someone's instability as our entertainment? That is not for me to decide. That is for the algorithm and the internet to decide. But that being said, you have to admit, this is quite possibly one of the most authentic interviews out there of, I guess, what you would call an A-list Hollywood actor. The last time this kind of happened was what pretty much any Kanye interview or maybe Charlie Sheen's interview back in the day. But that being said, it really goes to show that if you really want to see true authenticity on the internet, it's going to be extremely polarizing and confrontational. You see a lot of things, and everywhere there's this common notion on social media that authenticity is power and it's king and it's super praised. But if you truly want to see and experience real authenticity, it might rub you the wrong way. It might be extremely hard to watch. You might not agree with most of it, but that's what true authenticity is. But that's on another note. If you look at where Shia is in life and what led to this interview, he basically, I believe, moved to New Orleans and was celebrating Mardi Gras with a bunch of other drunk partygoers, and eventually, or actually often, within that I guess, drinking binge session, he got into a lot of verbal confrontations and a few physical fights. But this is nothing new for him. This is something he's done within his, I guess, entire past history. And it might sound like I'm defending him. Absolutely not. Another disclaimer is that I'm not here to defend him by any means, because if you actually look deeper at what he's done in the past, he has a pretty extensive, I guess, criminal track record. He's been notably violent, captured on video and audio recordings. He's had multiple allegations from his past romantic lovers, and he, I guess, has kind of shown to be quite an abusive person to be around, even on set during his work. You know, when it comes to allegations, you kind of have to be careful about that, because allegations literally mean anybody can allegate or allege anything to anybody. But if you really look at what he's been caught for or convicted for, it, I guess, kind of makes sense, unfortunately. And this video is not to defend him in any of his actions. I think anything when it comes to abuse and violence shouldn't be tolerated at all. It should be kind of a zero tolerance policy. The only case is what, potentially self-defense. And in this case, he seems to be the instigator for a lot of these situations. So a lot of these things are inexcusable, but I was trying to give him a potential benefit of the doubt going into this video. So I watched the few really well-produced real video essay commentary videos about it that can edit and produce it and look through his entire data and track record deeper than I can. And unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence and proof that he's actually done these things. So going through these videos and kind of researching fairly loosely, I guess, about how he came up and how his childhood upbringing was, a lot of it begins to make sense. A lot of people that end up criminals or have a violent background end up growing up in violent backgrounds. That's the thing that I think a lot of what you would call, I guess, middle-class suburban America doesn't really understand when it comes to violence and criminals, I guess. All of it should not be tolerated, but a lot of violence and growing up in neighborhoods where that's the norm, hitting somebody in the face, starting arguments, or stealing things is not exactly abnormal. It's a way of life. And that doesn't excuse it for being acceptable by any means, but in places all around the world, let alone America, people literally live in constant violence and bad childhood upbringings. In his particular case, he might not look like a typical gangster or what you would even consider that as, but in his words, he grew up in the ghetto, and he grew up in extreme poverty with a very abusive, I guess, drug-addicted dad. And that being your starting point, you don't really have many choices in life in terms of how you're going to behave and where you'll end up. That being said, I guess he scored the lottery, as what he said within this Channel 5 interview, that he ended up making it really big. But it was kind of a pretty intensive incline to get to that position, because what did he do before? Basically, he grew up in poverty, and they were really struggling with money, the entire family, and eventually he decided he wanted to get into showbiz and entertainment. In order to do that, he started off really, really young. I think it was like 10 years old or maybe even younger, but basically, he ended up developing the stand-up comedy shtick where he basically has a dirty mouth as a 10-year-old, and he's making really profane adult jokes. And he would play in gigs at bars and even, I believe, strip clubs at the age of 10, talking about things that he shouldn't be talking about, I guess. But he was able to make some money and get his foot in the door in terms of the entertainment business. I can't imagine with that entire combination growing up like that, what that would do to your entire psychological makeup as you get older. So in the ghetto, poverty, performing at strip clubs, making dirty jokes, and then abused by his dad violently. And then all of a sudden, he's casted as the main character in a Disney series. How does that work? He was the main character in Even Stevens, which was a long-running, I guess, sitcom of an ordinary suburban kid getting into extraordinary situations, right? And this was his claim to fame as a child. And as we all know, which we'll get into the next thing, he is the perfect representation of what child star syndrome is. There's a common stereotype that every child star grows up entirely damaged. I mean, even I think Britney Spears was also on Disney as well, and look at her now. And there are many other figures such as Amanda Bynes, and the list goes on and on. If you get really, really famous at a young age and you're successful, the chances of you growing up to be a healthy, stable human being or an adult is, I guess, a lot more unlikely. Some people have done it, but you generally don't hear about them, and if they're doing well, you'll know them for doing well, not for, I guess, spiraling. And in this case, he's spiraling. If we dive into why child stars might potentially lean and start spiraling into an unhealthy way of life, getting into substance abuse problems and other issues, like in his case, getting in fights and whatever else, if I could summarize it as quickly as I can try, child stars, when you're a kid, you don't really know who you are, and you don't really know anything about the world. You don't even know what the word identity could even mean, right? And that only becomes sort of prevalent at the age of 16 to 18, and then your 20s, you kind of have an idea of who you are, and then you hit 30, and then you have to rethink all of that over, and then that happens every 10 years, basically, right? So as a kid, you're trying to figure out what you like and what the world is and what you can do, and more importantly, what gets responses from your parents. More importantly, the positive responses from your parents and potentially all the adults around you, and then your peers that you maybe went to school with. In his case, he was getting applause from drunk adults, whether it's his dad or the people at the bar when he was telling his jokes, and that gave him positive reinforcement, meaning that he should do that more in order to receive affection and love, right? And then as he became the Even Stevens sitcom main character star, he continues to get more and more positive reinforcement for playing this particular character. The thing is that I don't hear that people really mention when it comes to child stars, or particularly child actors, is that child actors are given a role that's written by grown-ass adults, producers, directors, and network executives. And as we know, with all of the information coming out these days about Hollywood and networks like Nickelodeon, it's not very nice. It's actually deplorable, and it's extremely disturbing what these producers and directors and what they're up to. To summarize it, it's basically just pure abuse. And imagine those people giving a role to a child star actor to play for years and years and years, and God knows what that kid or the parents had to do to get that kid that role, but let's just not go into that dark rabbit hole here now. But long story short, the kid is given a role that they have to copy and paste their entire identity for years on end, and especially if they're successful, it's even longer. Maybe a 5 to 7 year sitcom run, or potential movies that repeat where they play a particular archetype or a role, and they have to jump into this role 100% all the time in the most formulative years of their life, right? From 10 to 17 to 18, of where you're supposed to have, I guess, a potentially regular childhood, and you have an idea of your interests and who you are as a person. Your interests and who you are as a person is a fictional character that's written by someone else to give to you. So to summarize, when these child stars grow up, and when these movies end and these series ends, who are they anymore? They can't play who they were on Even Stevens anymore. They can't play who they were in that movie in real life anymore. And then the line between reality and who they were on a movie or TV show gets entirely blurry. If you look at Shia's case, he's had a long portfolio and discography when it comes to his movies and projects, and he's played a multitude of different characters. And what it seems like now is like his characters are kind of bleeding into reality. And you'll see this a lot with a lot of different types of actors, but specifically method actors, right? Back in the day, it's not even that long ago, there's a thing called method acting. These days, it's kind of expired because not only are movies not that great, but Hollywood is kind of dying. But if you were big enough, you basically could get away with a thing called method acting, where you pretend and act to be the character that you're going to play in a movie, but even when the cameras are off. So when you're having lunch with the crew or you're going home, you still maintain, I guess, a mustache and wear the outfit that your character is, and then you talk and act like them outside of being on camera. In everyday life, you still act to be that character. Honestly, this stuff is kind of overrated is the wrong word, but a lot of the people that get into method acting have an entirely bad reputation for just being terrible people to be around, and they take it way too seriously, which is good. And sometimes it does give good results in the end. Like, unfortunately, if you go too far into it, you can end up like Heath Ledger that played the Joker, where he actually locked himself into motel rooms for months at a time, scribbling crazy people notes in his journal, and then eventually he actually lost his mind, which led to his untimely death, right? So Shia LaBeouf was an attempted method actor, and in multiple roles. He was actually, dropping substances and drinking on set to play a certain character. In this movie called Fury, it's a war movie. It's actually incredible. And you can see Shia's real range when it comes to acting in that movie. In Fury, where he basically plays a soldier in command of a tank, and there are some pretty notable actors that are co-stars with him. He actually pulled out his tooth seriously to get more into the role. And he does this quite often from accounted stories of people on set. And he's also notably extremely hard to work with, arguing with directors. And eventually, I think he even punched Tom Hardy in the face on set. Again, violence should never be tolerated, especially in that setting. But that being said, that level of intensity that he's drawn to was kind of set as a standard when he was a kid, and his dad would, I guess, abuse him in that way. And growing up in the hood, the ghetto, he was probably involved in some potential street fights, and then being raised and surrounded by people where violence was the norm. And then all of a sudden, he's like a family-friendly, suburban Even Stevens character. I mean, imagine what that would do to your sense of identity in your formative years and how you should behave. So, if we kind of like speed run his life, he's bouncing between extremes constantly. But one overarching thing is that he's drawn to intensity overall, intense roles, being intense, doing intense performance art where he's basically watching himself for 72 hours, or basically pushing the limits of what he thinks acting could be. In potential interviews of his, he was basically stating that he didn't like being on Transformers and doing, Hollywood blockbuster films, because he wanted to be respected and revered as like a real classical Hollywood actor that would be exploring, themes and films that were very deep and revered amongst the masses, right? However, I don't think that in his own mind he's attained any bit of quality of that, which is why he continuously tries to push the limit of how far he can go with his own intensity and projects. In his recent film, I think it was called Honey Boy, he dressed up and wrote the script for this movie where he plays his drunk, alcoholic, abusive dad raising himself. That is a lot of voluntary psychological torture, in a sense, to put yourself into intentionally. So his mind will naturally gravitate towards things that are extremely psychologically challenging. And that's what you'll see a lot of, actors that want to be taken seriously do as well. Some are able to survive doing that much more than others. Some can do it and then just go out and leave just fine, like a Cillian Murphy or Joaquin Phoenix or something like that. But in his case, the line between fiction and reality gets extremely blurry with how he chooses to live his actual life and who he depicts in the movies as well. He was famous too young, and that's what you'll see with every type of actor and musician that achieves stardom at such a young age. Yes, even being famous at 20 to 21 is a lot on the mind, which is why rock stars that are, considered legendary now joined the 27 Club, left us a little bit early. That level of intensity is too much for practically anybody to absorb, but let alone somebody who was a child star or got famous too early. It reinforces the fact that your intensity and who you think you should be is how you receive attention and love from the masses. And as we know, things, when it comes to entertainment and audiences, they're very fickle, and trends and cultural waves come and go just as fast as they show up. And if we go back to Shia, because he is somebody that is so driven towards intensity, I keep repeating the word intense because he is. And I think it kind of summarizes the whole aura of what he represents. There is nothing, I believe, that he could do in normal, everyday, casual, day-to-day life that will ever feel normal or good enough to him. Because as somebody who was the main star of Transformers, of giant anthropomorphic robots that basically explode and destroy every city that they walk across, to all of the performance art that he's done, to all the upbringing that he went through, to all the current movies that he's method acted in. He's already set this standard of life that is so crazy that literally making your own dinner in the morning and just taking a gentle walk through the park is not nearly enough to scratch that itch. You'll see this with a lot of addicts, but also you'll see them with musicians and artists and people within the creative and entertainment world that are allowed to experience a life of an intensity turned up past 10. Once you reach those types of heights, which Shia has, it's almost impossible to go back ground floor, feet planted on the earth, doing everyday mundane tasks. There were moments in his history where I think he attained and tried to reach sobriety, going to rehab and all of the other things. I think he even started a project where he's trying to unify people and help people in need and things like that. And these personalities might go through phases of sobriety and health, but because so much of most of their life has been built on intensity, it rewires your entire brain and dopamine threshold that no matter how much you try to live a regular life, there will always be an impulsive need to gain that intensity again. And because of that lifestyle, it overrides your prefrontal cortex, right? What do I mean by prefrontal cortex? The part that is responsible for rationality and critical thinking, which can come in a lot stronger when you're a bit older. I think it really, really forms when you're like 30 and you start regretting all of your past actions earlier in life, right? He ends up showing a lot of self-awareness in the end, especially in these interviews. Like he'll say he'll take accountability, he realizes what he's done is wrong, blah, 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 and then maybe in a year or a few months, he'll end up doing whatever he used to do. Because again, rational intellect and emotional awareness and emotional impulsivity are actually very separated. Just because somebody is very rationally intellectual and can kind of speak through things doesn't mean that they're also in control of themselves at an emotional and impulsive level. You'll see this polarity and dissonance, this tension with a lot of people. I can't name anybody at the top of my head, but particularly with famous people, this happens a lot. You know, they can show a level of understanding and they might be very eloquent, but behind the scenes, they can be very emotionally erratic. I lived a life that was kind of along the lines of that, being in entertainment and music and social media myself. And now that I'm older, I'm able to kind of, integrate the two. And that integration is definitely not easy. It comes with a lot of work, a lot of therapy, but a lot of, activities that are giving you the opportunity to integrate those two. And also, you just chill out. You chill out when you're a bit older. But because of Shia's intense life and his constant track record of being able to score really, really intensive and big projects in movies and TV shows, you kind of extend that timeline a lot longer, because I believe he's about to reach 40 now. And this is kind of like a fork in the road when it comes to adulthood for a lot of people. You either continue going down that bad path, or you have to go the other way to a better path, but that basically requires a ton of sacrifice and letting go of all the things that defined you as you, including all of the unhealthy things, right? So basically, you're not screwed, but the level of intensity that makes you feel alive and makes your life worth living, that you could live at the age of 20 to 25 to even maybe 16 too, the stuff that made you feel alive at those ages, they don't exactly lead to a very healthy and sustainable life. If you're past 30 or let alone 40, you can't exactly party and go as crazy as you did in your 20s. You don't have the same amount of energy. You don't recover as much. And also, societally, it just looks really bad too. And it looks bad for a good reason, because if you're not at least attempting to try to wrap things up at a certain age, it can really spiral to something a lot worse in the future. What amplifies a lot of this, right? Substance abuse, because a lot of famous entertainers and people within acting and creativity and all these things end up leaning to substance abuse because it allows them to turn their intensity to perform either on stage or sustain that intensity off stage as well. Not only that, if you're not going to do that, you're going to find other ways to gain that intensity. In his case, it's him screaming at people and getting in fights with people. In an interview that I remember on the Channel 5 channel, he basically mentions that He says out loud that he has a short man complex, a Napoleonic complex. Napoleon was a French general that kind of conquered a good amount of Europe, and he was known to be very, very short. And this is kind of like a humorous, stereotypical theme when it comes to short men, I guess. But I think it can go further than actual physical stature. Even though he says himself that's because he feels short, I think it's actually kind of a better metaphor. And it's figurative, meaning that anybody who feels short, metaphorically in life, they feel smaller in life, they have to overcompensate by God knows what, getting a ton of money, becoming a CEO, becoming the boss of something and harassing their employees, or they want to be super duper famous and be bigger and larger than life. They have something to prove because early in life, they were taught that they didn't matter and they felt very small. Nearly, I would say, 90% of entertainers and creative people are dealing with this short man complex at a figurative level. A lot of them grew up feeling like they didn't, belong. Maybe they don't have enough self-esteem because they were always pushed aside or people ignored them and they felt small in life. So they will dive even harder to whatever their art form is and attempt to get as much views on the internet as possible, or to dive into the entertainment industry to become an actor and to be celebrated, or to be rich and whatever else. A lot of things that kind of dictate human behavior later in life is because of some sort of hole that gets developed as a kid psychologically. And in this case, it's short man syndrome, right? It's feeling small early in life and later on to be proven to be taken seriously and bigger. In Shia's case, I think there's a lot of layers. I think he was tired of being small and, with that harsh upbringing. And then he was kind of this, clean-shaven suburban kid that was basically making movies for families. And then later in life, he wanted to prove that he was a real actor and to be taken seriously. And I guess to feel powerful and even feared. I have actually, you'll see this in situations, for example, like even when Miley Cyrus reached her, I guess, rap era, right? You'll see this a lot with certain child stars that try to break out of this clean image that was imposed upon them as a kid when they were shown at TVs and houses for the whole family. And then later on, they want to grow up and then they overcompensate by becoming as edgy and, offensive or weird or crazy as possible. In this case, it seems like Shia is trying to prove his, for lack of a better word, I guess, masculinity, trying to be taken seriously and, tired of being a joke that he probably tells himself from a message that happened way longer ago, but it's still this repeating voice in his head, hence why he's taking all of these very intensive roles and acting super intense in his later life. That's kind of a summary of why I think he's losing his mind, because most celebrities end up doing that, and you know what also amplifies that? A ton of money and time. Obviously, it's hard to feel sympathy for any celebrity that has millions of dollars, and I'm not here to try to sympathize with anybody in that situation, but I think it's also my potential acting background that attempts to understand practically anybody. If you want to get into acting, you're going to have to put yourself in the shoes of people and roles that you might not agree with, or thinks in ways that you don't naturally think. I think that's kind of my pull towards trying to understand figures like him and people in general. But that being said, having too much money and time, especially as an A-list Hollywood actor, you kind of have done everything at that point. You've flown around, you traveled the world, you've shot in iconic locations, you've dated practically anybody you could. And then what do you do after all of it? Nothing will ever scratch that itch before. And then all of a sudden you're fighting a bunch of drunk Americans on the street in New Orleans. That amount of money where you don't have to even look at your bank account and you can buy practically anything at any point, or buy a first class ticket on a private jet to Wakanda, right? You don't have to work and implement some needed purpose to survive every day, meaning you have a ton of time. And if you're an artist and you're creative, having too much time is the worst thing that you can possibly do to your head if you're not applying it to your art or creativity or anything that's beneficial towards you. In his case, he's multimillionaire and he has a lot of time. And what is he doing now? He should be acting, right? I think that's the last kind of piece to this puzzle, is that the fact that he is in this industry that he's relied on all of his life in showbiz, where you have to rely on pleasing producers and actors and casting agents, and then you get a role for about a year, and then you dive in it fully, then you take out your tooth and you drink on set, and then you punch somebody, right? Unfortunately, Hollywood is dying. I saw a video the other day and talking about how bad it is there. They've lost a lot of money. Film sets don't film there anymore. It's too expensive. Not many people pay to go even watch movies anymore. It's all taken over by the content engine, short form clips and I guess quick dopamine and, podcasts, just talking, but nothing to actually allow actors to dive deep into a role, to kind of put their entire all and intensity into it and have that be viewed by millions of people. I don't think he's necessarily running out of opportunities, but the industry is not the same as it used to be, where he could just book any interesting role or write his own screenplay and get funding immediately. He might be on this Channel 5 interview on YouTube because he also knows to gain relevance in the current media landscape, you kind of have to play the game of the social media content engine in the same way Timothée Chalamet is also doing the same thing as well. I'm wondering if that could potentially even be another factor of like when you, in his case, and a lot of other artists' case, let alone anybody with a job, AI and the current social media content engine has completely flipped so much of the entertainment world on its head that a lot of people are left without a job, but also not knowing what to do with themselves anymore, right? If you had dreams to become a musician, and then this music industry is dying as we visualize it, AI is taking over in the same way. If you want to be a famous actor and you get casted in movies that are watched by millions of people, make a full-time living and become an A-list Hollywood red carpet walker, you could try it, but now there's no infrastructure and there's no money anymore. There's not nearly as many roles in the entertainment world, let alone roles in corporate jobs. So, like him, everybody else as well is kind of undergoing potentially a collective identity crisis. Everybody's kind of faced with this existential role of not having a role. And I don't think it's just him only. I think he's a good symbol and representation of an extreme that can anchor a discussion like this, but I don't think he's the only one going through a similar situation. I think these days a lot of people are behaving quite erratically and are extremely emotionally unstable. I think a lot of people are getting into fights in New Orleans bars, right? He just happens to be extremely famous. Therefore, he kind of puts his stuff out there and he has a history of things that are kind of hard to ignore. But that being said, that's kind of my loose rundown and perspective over this Shia LaBeouf situation. I'm merely here just to give some light, low-effort intellectual stimulation in the background while you do something productive, while you're gaming, while you're trying to fall asleep or wake up in the morning. But I thought this was a really interesting thing to cover because there are so many layers to this, and I'm actually surprised that I was able to cover all of that. But in case of Shia LaBeouf himself, I think what would really benefit him is just diving head first into martial arts, combat sports, even professional wrestling, or being a commentator for them. He would be smashing it if that's the case. Because for somebody like him, he needs somewhere to place his intensity. And I don't know if it's going to solve everything, because I'm not a psychologist at all, but it could definitely help. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Into the Ether, ASMR commentary where you can sleep in luxury. I'm Pierre, and hope to see you next time. See you later.